In a church parking lot, a woman is found murdered. The killer leaves few clues and no weapon. A routine suicide investigation takes a macabre twist. Can a camera prove this was murder? And a fire rages in a nursing home, killing 15 residents. Armed only with his photographs, it will take the coroner 6 years to prove this tragedy was no accident. Forensic photographers solved these crimes by preserving crucial details missed by the naked eye. After the evidence is erased, the new detectives must rely on camera clues. In Fairfax County, Virginia, in March 1989, a man called police to report a woman had fallen in an icy church parking lot. An officer reported back from the scene. The woman didn't slip and fall. She was murdered. At police headquarters, forensic photographer Jeff Miller knew he had a long night ahead of him. He packed his equipment and got ready to meet investigators gathering at the scene. Where some officers shoot criminals, Miller shoots film. In his 18 years with the Fairfax Police, he has witnessed countless crime scenes through his lens. If he is the eyes of law enforcement, then his photos are its long-term memory.
Hey, this is the ID we got off of the victim.
Investigators arrived at the parking lot and planned their strategy. Detective Ed Guckenberger headed the investigation. As his team uncovered clues, they depended on Miller. It's in Miller's camera that all the clues come together to solve a case and hopefully to catch a killer.
We want to be able to document the scene, in essence, take the scene from here to the courthouse just exactly the same way that we find it.
Miller began by mapping the crime scene. The initial clues were both simple and brutal. The victim was lying face up in a pool of her own blood. She had been shot several times, with the fatal bullet to her head. Nearby, her purse was found untouched. Robbery was not the motive. Miller first documented the wide view of the crime scene, which was blanketed in darkness. To bring it into focus, Miller used a technique called painting with light. The camera was mounted on a tripod. Its shutter kept open as an assistant covered the lens. The same frame of film was exposed repeatedly as Miller passed along the edges of the scene, firing his flash as many as 24 times for a single picture. Each flash illuminates a slightly different area. This photograph is the result of Miller's work. The bright lights look like street lamps, but they were made by Miller's flash. Though he was holding the flash as it fired, Miller doesn't appear because he was behind the light. He remained invisible as he exposed the evidence. After Miller took his wide shot by painting with light, he moved in to photograph every detail of the scene. He worked his way closer and closer to the victim, documenting her wounds and the position of her body.
You guys see these bloody tire tracks?
Miller discovered some bloody tire tracks near the victim.
It looks like when a vehicle left here, it ran through the pool of blood.
Officers were sent to follow the trail, while others stayed behind to comb for additional clues. Miller found 2 bullet casings. the man who called the police parked his van over them. Miller photographed the evidence where it lay. Moving the van again would only have disturbed more of the crime scene.
Hey guys.
As Miller hunted for additional evidence, officers returned from their search of the neighborhood. They found an abandoned car a block away. They ran the tags. It was registered to the victim's address. The site of the car became a second crime scene. Again, Miller photographed the scene from every angle, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain how the woman ended up so far from her vehicle. As he did at the church parking lot, Miller first photographed the site at a distance, then moved in for close-ups. The driver's side window was shattered. Pellets of glass were strewn about the car's interior. A spent cartridge lay in the snow outside the driver's side door, and a bullet was lodged in the plastic molding. On the passenger's side, Miller found even more. Pressed into the thin snow were footprints, too big to be the victim's. Forensic technicians have a tough time making casts of snowy tracks, and Miller knew the prints would melt with the rising sun. So it was up to him and his camera to preserve the evidence before it faded away.
You can cut it out if it's in ice and try to keep it at a certain temperature and everything else. Well, I guess sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There are different chemicals that you could possibly spray on it to try and keep it. When all in all is said and done, the photograph is the only evidence that was able to totally keep that impression intact.
The search of the neighborhood uncovered more potential evidence. A patrolman found a second car, abandoned a half-mile from the church parking lot after apparently skidding off the road. The second car became the third crime scene during this night of sporadic clues. Police began to search for a connection. On the seat, an officer found a leather gun holster. He ran the tags on the vehicle. The owner lived just 2 doors from the victim.
Process this scene.
At dawn, Jeff Miller inspected the church parking lot again. He hoped the sun would shed new light on the case. By now, the snow had melted.
We wanted to come back and check the asphalt parking lot and make sure that we collected all the evidence. We don't want to leave anything behind. Once we leave here, you can't come back.
His effort paid off. Daylight revealed fragments of glass buried in the snow the night before. If the glass matched the broken window in the victim's car, police could say the car was in the parking lot when she was killed.
Okay, there's something over here.
The melting snow also revealed a bullet at the edge of the lot.
So tell you what, let me get a couple pictures of it first.
Tests would determine if it matched the bullet found in the victim's car. While Miller checked the parking lot, Ed Guckenberger hit the road. His first stop, the victim's house. In homicide cases, family members are usually the first suspects.
I have to read very quickly once I knock on that door the type of response that I get from that person who opens it. And in this case, I had a husband that was dressed in a bathroom that I had woken up out of his sleep. He stated that His wife should have been home, and she was at a church meeting. As a homicide investigator, what you then have to do is you have to read that person. Does he seem sincere? Is this some ploy or something else? Well, there was nothing from what he was telling me to show that he was in any way involved in this.
Confident the husband wasn't involved with the woman's murder, officers followed their next lead. They didn't have far to go. The owner of the second car was the victim's neighbor. He was also no stranger to police. The churchyard murder investigation was less than 10 hours old. So far, Detective Guckenberger had no suspects. His only lead was the owner of the second car. The man police wanted to talk with was Gary Asa Donahue. Ed Guckenberger asked him to come to the station for questioning. To his buddies in his motorcycle gang, Donahue was known as Redneck. Police knew him by his criminal record. Donahue told police he'd been out drinking the night before. When he got home, he realized his dog was loose, so he drove around to look for him. He lost control of his car on the icy road and skidded into a ditch. Unable to get free, Donahue said he walked home. Although his route would have taken him past the victim's car, Donahue told police he didn't see it. He said the holster in his own car belonged to a friend, but he didn't have the gun. Police were suspicious. They asked Donahue for his jacket and boots, which might hold clues that told a different story. Donahue willingly surrendered them. In the darkroom, Miller developed one of his most hopeful leads. Up until now, he'd been merely documenting the various crime scenes. Now, he put his darkroom skills to the test to flush out latent clues. Using the ruler he placed by the icy footprints when he snapped the photo, Miller created a life-size portrait of the prints. A boot print can be almost as telling as a fingerprint, if it's clear enough. Miller was happy with the photo. Armed with this image, it became just a matter of matching the prints to the boots that made them. Miller sent his photographs to a forensic lab for a detailed comparison with Donahue's boots. Lab technicians first examined the size of the boots. If the prints are off, even by a few millimeters, there is no match. The tread pattern was examined next. Technicians pored over the sole of the boot, making sure that every detail matched Miller's photograph. So far, so good. But next came the litmus test, matching the boot to the foot that wore it. It required a close look at the boot's anatomical wear.
An anatomical wear is the wear that each of us impart into the bottom of the shoe based on how tall we are, how much we weigh, our bone makeup, how we walk, whether we walk on the inside of our feet, the outside of our feet, more so on the heel, more so on the toe.
Donahue wore a lift in one of his boots. It added to the unique anatomical wear and left its signature in the boot prints. Last, technicians examined the boots and the photographs for accidental wear and tear, nicks and cuts from daily use.
In this particular case, there are certain marks, certain cuts, certain indentations in the tread pattern that the examiner was able to see in the photograph and was able to find also in the shoe, that he is able to say that this shoe made this impression to the exclusion of all the other shoes in the whole wide world.
The footprint evidence placed Donahue at the victim's car. Guckenberger credits the photographs with keeping the investigation on track.
If We didn't have the photographs of that shoe impression. Then we're mainly just stuck with firearms evidence. A person might have a gun, but who actually shoots that gun? But this person wears his own boots.
Investigators then examined Donahue's jacket, combing it meticulously for fibers, hair, cloth, anything that might link Donahue to the victim. They found glass particles. What new information could they provide? Forensic tests determined the glass from the victim's car matched the glass in the parking lot. If the glass from Donahue's jacket matched these samples, it would place Donahue at the site where the car window was shattered and where the victim was killed. The glass matched. Police could now prove that Donahue was in the parking lot and maybe in the car at the time of the murder. The bloody tire tracks were the next link. Because the victim couldn't have driven through her own blood, investigators were able to show she was killed in the parking lot and that somebody else moved her car.
As her car was leaving the scene, it drove through a pool of blood that was coming from her. The blood adhered to the tire, and the rotation of the tire through the parking lot kept leaving a blood transfer onto the ground. So that's what that was from.
The scattered clues were coming together, thanks in large part to Miller's accurate documentation of the scene. The only thing missing was the murder weapon. To help pinpoint it, investigators tested the bullets and casings found near the victim and her car. Another casing was found in Donahue's car. Lab tests showed all the casings were fired from a rare Hungarian pistol, a 9mm auto-loading Fromer, a gun that peaked in popularity around World War II. Tests of the impression on the holster from Donahue's car matched the impression a Fromer would make. But the gun was nowhere to be found. Police scoured the area and came up empty. Donahue, for all his earlier cooperation, drew the line at providing the gun, swearing he never had it.
And he probably thought that whatever he did with this gun, and I don't know, we never did find that gun, probably thought that he was past all this. That if we didn't have a gun, we probably could not prove that he was the one that actually fired the shot or did anything else.
But if there ever was a smoking gun in this case, it was Miller's photographs of the boot prints, something Donahue didn't count on. Officer Miller and Detective Guckenberger began to build their case. With the glass fragments, the shell casings, the bullets, and the ever-important boot prints, they were confident they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Gary Asa Donahue was a killer.
Okay, great.
Miller's photographs became primary evidence before a grand jury, which sent back Donahue's indictment. The photographic clues that Miller provided helped piece together the story of that ill-fated night.
Okay, what I believe happened is that Mr. Donahue's driving down the street. He turns down the wrong street to go to his house, probably because he's drunk.
Donahue lost control of his car and slid off the road. Angry, he got out of the car and began to walk home. As the victim came down the street, she recognized the car. She likely had seen it in her neighborhood for years. Donahue bought it from another neighbor.
Perhaps she's acting as a good Samaritan. She stops to offer him a ride, or perhaps he stepped out on the road and flagged her down. The other possibility is he stepped out on the road with the gun and made her stop for him. They go down the street to the church parking lot. Something occurs inside the car in the church. I don't know what that is. In homicide investigation, you're not always going to be able to answer every single question that you have. she falls down to the ground, lays down on her back, face up. Donahue then has a better target, a non-moving target. He then advances towards her, and as she's lying there on the ground, he puts the gun right up to her face almost and executes her. He then leaves the scene, drives down to the end of the street, where again, for whatever reason, he runs off the road, probably due to his intoxication, runs off the road, wrecks it into the trees. For whatever reason, he decides to clear his weapon. He works the action, the one cartridge casing that's still in the gun, ejects out the broken driver's window, and is found on the ground next to the vehicle.
For whatever reason, he slid across the seat and left by the passenger's side, leaving his boot prints in the snow.
This is your worst type of killer, because this is the person that kills out of meanness. There was no reason at all to kill this woman. She was not, your victim that puts herself in a situation because of a crime. She's not that type of person. She's the type of person that her innocence is what got her into trouble. That day, she ran across an animal.
Gary Asa Donahue was sentenced to life in prison. The senseless death of the woman in the church parking lot shocked the residents of her quiet community. Further south, in Miami, Florida, murder is more common, but no less shocking. Through these doors at the Metro-Dade County Morgue in Florida come every kind of death, both natural and unnatural. As bodies come into the morgue, it's the job of forensic photographers to document wounds and other identifying traits before the corpses are stored. The work is never routine and often tragic. On this day, a 5-year-old girl is the victim of a random shooting. She was caught in crossfire during a parade. Forensic technicians examine her wounds. Perhaps they hold the key to the killer. Dade County detectives rely on the information to start their investigation.
We are trying to determine, number one, what caliber of round it was that did strike the victim. And number two, the path of the bullet as it entered the body and then exited. That will help us in trying to determine possibly who our shooter is.
In the medical examiner's office, high-tech photography is as much a tool of the trade as a scalpel. If a death looks suspicious, it's up to forensic photographers to document the details. They start with the wound and then photograph individual organs as the autopsy proceeds. These gruesome photographs survive long after a case is closed. They provide a visual database authorities can refer to if a similar case comes up. Knowing what to look for streamlines any investigation. In 1986, Dade County Police responded to a suicide. Jack Sebastian lay dead, a 12-gauge shotgun by his side. When death is involved, it's standard procedure to capture everything on film.
Did you see anyone enter or leave the house?
The victim's girlfriend told police she was outside when she heard the blast.
I want to get everything.
Sebastian left no note. At the morgue, a staff member felt suspicious about Sebastian's wound and called medical examiner Jay Barnhart.
Good morning, Dr. Alvarez. What do you have?
Barnhart mapped and measured the wound.
Which appears appears to be an entrance.
In his initial opinion, this was no suicide. Sebastian was shot almost directly between the eyes. His wound was surrounded by stippling, small speckled burns made by the gunpowder exploding from the shotgun's muzzle. If Sebastian held the gun directly to his head, the gunpowder wouldn't have marked his face. From the stippling, Barnhart knew the gun must have been held some distance from Sebastian's forehead when he pulled the trigger. Something wasn't right, and Barnhart was determined to get to the bottom of it. First, Barnhart ordered photographs of Sebastian's wounds. Then he took X-rays of Sebastian's head to reveal the internal damage he couldn't see. The X-ray showed the path of the pellets.
This is an X-ray showing the dispersion of the birdshot through the skull. And if we take the point of entrance, which is just above the bridge of the nose, and connect that by an imaginary line or series of lines to the location of the pellets, we see that the pellets are to the left and below the point of entrance, meaning that the shot then was coming from above and to the right of the entrance.
Barnhart had to find out if Sebastian could hold the gun at the angle indicated by the X-ray. It wouldn't have been easy. Investigators even placed the shotgun in the extended arms of Sebastian's corpse to see if he could fire the gun. His fingers could barely reach the trigger. Considering all possibilities, investigators tried to fire the gun with their feet. They found they could do it with bare toes. But Sebastian wore round-toed boots, making it impossible for him to fire the gun. These extreme tests were necessary. Barnhart knew that in court, he must be prepared to answer even the strangest questions.
They'll ask you things like, well, couldn't he have been laying in bed and have his foot up over his head and pulled it with his... and if he'd not been wearing shoes, you'd probably have to say, yes, he could.
Barnhart wasn't satisfied with his findings. He needed to determine the distance between Sebastian and the gun when it fired. Barnhart and his staff shot a piece of poster board from distances of 1 to 7 feet and examined the damage. From 1 foot away, the force of the shot cracked the board. The impact was enormous. At 2 feet, the impact was less severe as the buckshot began to spread. At 4 feet, the hole roughly doubled in size as the pellets fanned out. At 6 feet from the board, the buckshot dispersed further, leaving clear pellet marks. Barnhart concluded the muzzle of the gun had to be at least 1.5 feet away from Sebastian's head. He was convinced someone else must have pulled the trigger. But Barnhart feared his simple test wasn't enough to sway a jury. He turned to the Forensic Imaging Bureau for help. Todd Reeves runs Dade County's Forensic Imaging Bureau, one of the best in the United States. The Bureau has more than 3,000 square feet of advanced photographic equipment. The well-equipped studios can document huge pieces of evidence while capturing clues invisible to the naked eye. Here, a technician uses a microscope-equipped camera to examine a cast of a jawbone. Her findings will help match a suspect to a bite mark. A potentially useful image may come from a less than perfect source, like a security camera or shot from a moving vehicle. The lab can clean up, enlarge, and enhance photographs. Computers reveal unseen details in evidence photos, bringing clues into focus. A huge computer database of fingerprints can match even the vaguest finger smudge. An editing suite helps investigators assemble persuasive courtroom presentations.
The higher the quality, the better delineation you're giving the jury, the more factual information. And that's what we're providing is fact, not fiction. And that's the true message behind professional forensic photography.
Jay Barnhart knew he had a case for the murder of Jack Sebastian. But he'd rely on Reeves and his high-tech tools to make it bulletproof.
We got a case of this biker.
Every fatal wound tells a tale. In the case of Jack Sebastian, the injuries around the wound completed the story. When a gun fires, it shoots more than projectiles. From the muzzle comes a flash of fire, a blast of gas, a puff of smoke, and a shower of sparks. Each can leave its mark. Place the muzzle of a gun directly against the target, and all this debris goes into the wound. Pull the muzzle further away, and the debris becomes more and more dispersed. The forensic photographs of Sebastian's injuries showed the stippling wounds. They also revealed bruising under the eyes, on the nose, and on the cheek. Barnhart believed the damage was caused by the open petals of the shot cup, a plastic sleeve that holds the buckshot. But how far away would the shotgun have to be to allow the shot cup petals to open? Barnhart and Reeves believed high-speed photography could provide the definitive answer.
And it allows the doctors and the police that are investigating the case to be able to see things we can't see with the human eye, things that are moving as fast as Mach 15.
High-speed photography can stop a bullet in midair. More than that, it allows investigators to examine, frame by frame, the impact and damage that bullet produces as it connects with its target. Wounds can then be matched with bullets. In cases where no weapon is found or a bullet isn't recovered, a series of high-speed photos may help investigators make the identification. Reeves and Barnhart designed an experiment to determine the distance between Sebastian's head and the muzzle of the gun that killed him.
I don't know if there's any, I think we have film in the 35.
Crank it in there after it's in the vise.
They mounted a shotgun on a rack, held perfectly level. Next, they positioned two cameras along the line of fire. As the shell and debris left the muzzle, they would fly past the cameras, which would snap their picture. It was crucial that the gun not move when fired. They loaded the gun with the same type of ammunition that killed Sebastian.
Let it go.
Fire in the hole. Okay.
Reeves then placed a sensitive microphone near the muzzle of the gun. When the microphone picks up the sound of the shotgun blast, it trips a flash unit. A ruler placed behind the microphone measures how far the shell travels as the shot cup petals begin to open. The high-speed flash fires for 1/2 millionth of a second, necessary when photographing at blazing speeds. For the clearest image, Reeves and Barnhart need the camera to be as close to the flying shell as possible, but must determine the best place to put it. They first try the test with a large format Polaroid camera. The fast-developing film allows them to take test photos of the experiment so they can position the second camera correctly. For the actual test, they use a standard 35mm camera with highly sensitive film to freeze the shell in its path. The investigators are now ready to try their experiment and catch a shell with a flash of light. If all goes well, they'll produce an irrefutable record of the shell and its components in flight. Barnhart can then use the information to verify where the plastic petals on the shot cup began to open into the pattern that damaged Sebastian's face. Each time the gun is fired, Reeves inches the microphone away from the muzzle. As a result, the flash will go off a little later. The projectile will travel a little farther. The camera will catch it as it opens in flight. Initially, the white-hot plastic shot cup hasn't expanded. After 18 inches, the petals begin to spread, discharging the pellets and falling away. At about 30 inches, the petals have fully opened. Barnhart and Reeves succeed in making a photographic point-by-point map of a shotgun shell's trajectory. By comparing the wound with the pictures, investigators determined the gun was fired from a distance of 18 to 24 inches from Sebastian's face.
Expand our database here.
The results corroborated Barnhart's own experiments and gave him the evidence he needed to prove Sebastian couldn't have possibly shot himself. Police then confronted Sebastian's girlfriend, Diane Shelton, with the evidence. She confessed to pulling the trigger and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Unlike any other tool, forensic photography can expose evidence that would otherwise have been missed. And sometimes, photographs are the only way to prove a crime was committed at all. When a Pennsylvania coroner was certain a tragic accident camouflaged a mass murder, his photographs became his only allies. Forensic photography played a crucial role in the investigation of a devastating fire in a nursing home. Retired Wayne County, Pennsylvania coroner Robert Jennings spent 6 years trying to prove the fiery deaths were no accident. Jennings has spent much of his life combining his role as coroner and his love of photography. He has been snapping shots for more than 45 years.
We got some fire to the left here. Let's go and knock that down before we go in.
His story begins on the grim night of October 19, 1971. A fire killed all 15 residents of the Geiger nursing home, a private home attached to a farmhouse near Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Most of the victims were found in their beds, dead from smoke inhalation. A few were overcome as they crawled on the floor. As coroner, Jennings rushed to the scene. State police and firefighters had begun removing bodies before Jennings had a chance to document the area. After asking the firemen to stop, Jennings began photographing all he could. The location of the victims could prove important. Jennings tried to track the blaze with his camera lens inside the pitch-dark building. Time was of the essence. He went right to work, hoping his pictures could help determine what caused the blaze. But the darkness and smoke foiled his efforts. Reluctantly, he went home to await the sunrise. By the time he returned the next morning, the smoke had cleared and the gloom had lifted enough for him to get his shots of the ruins.
If your normal f-stop would be f11, then you would have to open up at least 2 more stops and give it more light to get the detail and so forth that's needed in this type of evidence photography, that at least arson experts have an opportunity to examine the charring and so forth.
Working in the crumbling shell of the building was time-consuming and treacherous. But Jennings was determined to commit every inch of the wreckage to film. He succeeded. painting with light revealed details of an alligator burn, a charring pattern similar to the rough scales of the reptile. The pattern is created at very high temperatures. By illuminating the area from several angles, Jennings photographed the changes in the burn pattern. Later, he would refer to his photographs to trace the fire's path. Burn patterns on the walls suggested the blaze tore through the hallway. A section of the corridor was almost totally consumed. In one spot, the fire burned a hole in the floor. The destruction at this spot was unlike anywhere else in the building. Jennings focused his attention and his camera on the hole. He crawled under it, photographing its edges. Fires usually burn from the bottom up, igniting whatever's above them. But at this spot, the fire looked to have burned from the top down. To Jennings, that suggested an accelerant was used, some flammable liquid that seeped through the floor, carrying flames with it. Before Jennings completed his investigation, state police announced their findings. They concluded the fire began in the laundry room, caused by a bad thermocoupling in a clothes dryer. Jennings wasn't buying it. He'd spend the next 6 years trying to prove them wrong. Photographs were Jennings' only clues. The ceiling above the dryer where the state police said the fire started showed minimal damage compared to the highly charred hallway. The wires in the laundry room were still intact. Jennings even found unburned clothing inside the dryer. Picture by picture, he continued building his case. Today, a quarter century later, Jennings' evidence remains, though the building is long gone.
Within a few weeks after the fire, the building is totally destroyed and demolished, razed. So therefore, the evidence that I photographed, that's gone. And if you don't have the photographs there to support, to look it over, it's pretty hard to solve a crime.
For Jennings, not much has changed in the art and science of photography since he snapped his first picture. Today, as he did 25 years ago in the Geiger nursing home case, he processes his own photographs by hand, carefully controlling every step of exposure, developing, and printing. He sharpened his skills, both as a photographer and an investigator. He's gained a better sense of what to look for and how to capture it on film. A charred piece of timber, a pile of debris. These seemingly trivial objects can be clues that make or break a case. Jennings has to be sure no detail is overlooked. An investigation is a lot like a roll of exposed film. All the information is there. You just have to know how to make it visible. In his darkroom, Jennings exposes many secrets, and in the process, he sometimes develops even more questions. State police were impressed by Jennings' photographs, but still wouldn't concede the fire was arson. They didn't waver for one simple reason: no suspect. If the fire had been deliberately set, who lit the match? In the end, Jennings' pictures exposed him. Hoping to prove the fire was deliberately set, Jennings turned to Nurse Vaudine Lyon, the sole survivor of the blaze. She told him about one of the home's gentlest patients, Mr. Maurice Flynn. Mr. Flynn, a deeply shy and private man, would end each day in his room, reading the Bible by candlelight. So it was odd that after the fire, Flynn's body was found seated in the room of a married couple. He was the only patient not in his own room when the fire occurred. He was also the only patient found completely naked. Scarcely burned, he died seated in a chair with his arms and legs extended, as though crucified.
He was known as the gentleman of the house. He was there to help people, but he was very private. He wouldn't even leave a nurse or anyone with him when he's taking a shower. He just didn't want any help. And this was always a puzzling part as to why this particular person was found this distance away.
Flynn's own room was some 60 feet from where his body was found. The smoke and flame would have made that simple walk impossible. Jennings determined the blaze started at the intersection of the hallways. In order for Flynn to get to the couple's room during the fire, he would have had to pass right through it. On the other hand, if he wanted to escape the blaze, the exit was near his room, easily within his reach.
And it's impossible that he could have come down that distance and through that T intersection with the type of physical evidence that we found on his body, because he would have never made it, and he would have been completely charred.
Jennings wondered why Flynn was so far from his room, while most everyone else died in bed from the fast-spreading blaze. On June 8, 1972, Robert Jennings exhumed the body of Maurice Flynn. Even before the autopsy, Jennings noticed something odd. Flynn's skin was almost cherry red, indicating carbon monoxide poisoning. The autopsy showed Flynn's lung tissue had absorbed gasoline vapors shortly before he died. More clues came out during Lyon's interview. Flynn was the only resident in the home allowed to have matches to light the candles by which he read his Bible. He also mowed the lawn around the nursing home, making him one of the only residents with access to gasoline. Flynn behaved strangely the day before the fire, ranting and citing biblical verse. The home's other residents also acted strangely. They paid off forgotten debts and talked of a journey to a better place.
Everything centered around the strange events of Mr. Flynn, why he was completely naked. One of his comments to one of the nurses on duty that day was that you come in this world naked and you leave it naked. And that stuck in our minds a lot with finding his completely nude body.
It looked like Jennings had his suspect. But state police wouldn't revise their conclusions. Jennings persisted. By early 1975, Jennings was confident that he had enough evidence to prove his case. He exercised his powers as coroner and swore in a jury of 6 men and women. He presented his findings while the state police defended their position during the 2-day legal battle. Afterward, the jury concluded the fire was caused by an illegal act by a person or persons unknown. They ruled that investigators should attempt to discover who caused the 15 deaths. Why Flynn set the fire will never be known. Some have speculated that his actions were the result of a deranged mind. Others have said Flynn and the other nursing home residents had all agreed to die, thinking it better to end their lives than live in the home. In the end, the closest we may ever come to finding out the cause of the fire lies in Jennings' photographs and his efforts at solving this crime. After the coroner jury's verdict, Jennings filled out the death certificates of the residents of the Geiger nursing home. 13 homicides and a suicide.
It was worth the effort. I felt that I had a duty to represent the other 14 people that paid a price, their lives in this particular incident, and particularly for the families as well.
Forensic photography is the new detective's secret weapon. Often overlooked, it is crucial in a criminal investigation. Through sophisticated camera equipment, determination, and ingenuity, forensic photographers become the eyes and memories of investigators. They are also the advocates of the victims, helping bring criminals to justice. Police in Connecticut begin to suspect a missing woman was murdered. But how can they prove it when they haven't got the body? After a 14-year search, a skeleton is found in a well. Is there enough left to determine what happened? A homicide investigation stalls until a dead man helps solve the mystery of his son's disappearance. Hiding the victim used to be the key to getting away with murder, but no longer. Even without a body, forensics can tear the fabric of lies and expose the bodies of evidence. A dead body. It's usually the first clue in a homicide. But without a victim, how can police catch the killer? Without a victim, how can they prove a murder occurred at all? In December 1986, Connecticut State Police were faced with just such a challenge. Hella Crafts, a 38-year-old flight attendant, had disappeared from her home in quiet Newtown, Connecticut. She left behind her husband Richard and 3 children. Her disappearance came as no surprise to Richard. Hella had recently filed for divorce after discovering he was having an affair. The Crafts' nanny, Marie Thomas, was worried. Her suspicions grew when she noticed stains on the carpet near Hella's side of the bed. She called Hella's best friend, who in turn contacted Hella's lawyer. According to State Police Detective Joseph DeStefano, Hella may have feared for her life.
Hella explained to her attorney that if for some reason she disappeared or wasn't around any longer or something wasn't right, and not to take it as being a coincidence, that there was something wrong. And she had asked her attorney, please look into it. That is exactly what had happened. Hella did disappear.
Police questioned Richard Crafts. Though they knew his situation with Hella was rocky, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Besides his day job as a commercial airline pilot, Richard was a town constable, sworn to uphold the law. But as state investigators talked to Hella's friends, suspicions about Richard began to grow.
When people were asking Richard where Hella was, he gave several different answers. At one point he said she was visiting her mother. At another point I believe he said she was visiting her sister. At another point he said he didn't know where she was. Things that weren't consistent with what a husband would say if his wife was missing. That in itself created some suspicion.
Police had enough information to obtain a search warrant of Kraft's house, but not enough to charge Richard with any crime. They still didn't know if this was a criminal investigation or a wild goose chase.
At this point in time, we had no answers. All we had were questions.
They hoped to find some answers in the Crafts' bedroom. By the time they obtained the warrant, the room was virtually empty, apparently to get ready for new carpeting, but perhaps also to disrupt the crime scene. Meanwhile, Richard was on his way to Florida for Christmas, and miles ahead of the police. Something happened here, but had the suspect erased all the evidence? Some of the furniture was discovered in the basement. Before investigators could examine the bedroom, they called in a friend of Hella's to tell them how it was arranged. After the room was back in order, the forensics team found stains on one side of the mattress. Blood spatter expert Henry Lee was called in to interpret them.
The first time when you hit somebody, usually don't produce spatter. You only can create a wound. When the blood starts deposit around the injury area, from the capillary or the vein, now you have pool of blood. The second time you hit it, then you have spatter.
Lee was able to determine from the size and distance the stains spread on the mattress that the blood spattered at medium velocity. That told him a little about the weapon.
We know it's some blunt object, but I cannot tell you that's a hammer, an axe, or flashlight. Could be any type of this blunt object.
One thing Lee and investigators concurred on. They had found the crime scene, and it suggested bloody murder. A faint pattern of blood on Hella and Richard Kraft's mattress was enough to turn up the heat on what was, until then, a missing persons investigation. Now, police felt that Hella might be dead, and that Richard Crafts had killed her. But the proof was scant, shaky. They were relying more on instinct than evidence. If Mrs. Crafts was killed, where was her body? They'd have to do their homework.
The next level of the investigation was a review of paperwork that we had found in Mr. Kraft's background, particularly his credit card receipts.
On the roster of routine purchases, one line stood out.
We found that Richard Crafts had rented a wood chipper from the Darien Rental Agency in Darien, Connecticut.
Though it seemed like a shot in the dark, DeStefano's sergeant suggested that perhaps Crafts used a wood chipper to eliminate the body. DeStefano was skeptical.
My immediate thought was things like that don't happen. They happen on television, but they don't happen in real life.
He went to Darien Rental to see if it was even possible to use a wood chipper to dispose of a body. The rental agent showed him the chipper that Richard Crafts rented on November 18th, around the same date Hella Crafts disappeared.
Okay, essentially what we have then, we've got all the material being fed in through this end.
Right.
And it's coming in contact with the cutters on the wheel over here.
Yeah, which is spinning.
Now, about how thick is that wheel? About 2 inches?
2 inches, yes, sir.
And that's solid steel?
Yeah, it weighs about 900 pounds.
900 pounds. Those blades, one on either side. So once that wheel gets moving, nothing stops it.
No, not at all.
The only thing that happens is whatever hits that gets cut.
Yeah, you could throw a piece of steel in there, it wouldn't make any difference. It would cut it up.
You say that opens up about 12 inches?
About 12 inches, yeah.
So 1,200 RPMs with a 900-pound piece of metal, two 12-inch blades. No way anything's going to stop that.
Not at all.
Though the massive blade could make short work of anything in its path, the hopper could only accommodate objects up to a foot wide. It would be impractical to dispose of a body that way, but not impossible. It seemed far-fetched. But while DeStefano was investigating the wood chipper, other detectives spoke with town workers to see if anyone had seen anything that might resemble a clue. A utility worker reported he was out in the early morning of November 19th. He saw someone operating what looked to be a wood chipper on River Road, adjacent to the Housatonic River. That chance observation propelled an otherwise stalled investigation. Attention shifted to River Road.
When the investigators got to that location, they did in fact find wood chips on the ground. In exploring the area all the more, they found envelopes with Helicraft's return address on them. At this point in time, we had the feeling that we've got something here that's totally out of the ordinary.
Investigators gathered 33 bags of debris from the River Road area. The bags were sent to the police station to be pored over piece by piece. Anything that wasn't a wood chip or a leaf was set aside.
At first we would find one hair, and not knowing what to do with it, we took a bottle and we put the one hair in the bottle. We would continue on, we'd find an object that was harder than wood but softer than stone. So we felt that we'll start another bottle for items such as these.
Out of the mulch, a grisly scenario was taking shape. Based on these initial findings, a tent was set up to process evidence on site. Konstantin Karazoulis, the state's chief forensic odontologist, or dental expert, was called in hopes of locating human dental remains.
We would collect evidence and bring it into a tent, and we would put it through some water, through a filter, and look for things that were human parts.
Circumstantial evidence was piling up. The blood in the bedroom, the wood chipper rental, the unidentified fragments in the wood chips. But there was still no body, and without a body, there was no crime. They needed to find something more definite. Investigators knew they had to turn the case around, or a killer would walk. While evidence of a crime was turning up along River Road, police continued interviewing potential witnesses. One spotted a man with a wood chipper on November 19th on a bridge about a mile south of the River Road site. Divers were sent to the bridge to see what they could recover. The water under a bridge is the repository of all things broken and discarded. It's a dumping ground for vandals and a place where unwanted possessions are tossed and forgotten. Most are mundane, but sometimes the unexpected turns up. Dan Lewis was one of the divers.
And what we were looking for was anything that could have been used as a weapon. We were looking for any type of a container, and certainly any more body fragments. Underneath this bridge, there's many parking meters, road signs, shopping carts, the usual kind of things that you'll find discarded off of a bridge. I mean, something like a chainsaw or a type of weapon will be totally out of place. When they came up with that, we immediately knew that we may have something here that pertained to that case.
Like everything else in this case, the chainsaw's connection was tenuous. The tool was sent to Dr. Lee's lab to see if a link could be made. Meanwhile, a mile north at the tent, Detective DeStefano was making a gruesome discovery of his own.
I had just put some debris into the screen. I had rinsed it off, and my normal course was after I would rinse, I would go through it with my fingers just to make sure that it was totally rinsed. As I was going through, you develop a certain feel for what you're dealing with, and wood chips have a certain consistency about them. As I went through, I felt something that didn't feel like a wood chip. It felt slippery. And when I held it under the light, I found it to be the tip of a finger.
The evidence of the crime was becoming ever more apparent, but it still wasn't strong enough to prove Hella's murder or to name her killer. The pieces would start to come together in Lee's lab as the chainsaw was studied.
The chainsaw deposit in the river must have a reason. We initially don't know what's the significance and the linkage, But by examining the chainsaw, we found tiny fragment of hair. Under a higher power magnification, microscopic examination, we made a determination that's human. Not only human, we noticed this hair was bleached and dyed.
To Lee's assistant, Elaine Pagliaro, the bleached and dyed hairs were all too familiar. Over 2,000 of them had already been recovered from the wood chips and examined.
The roots were of something we call paintbrush type. This paintbrush appearance to a root is characteristically found when hair is in tissue, and then that tissue starts to putrefy, and the chemicals from the putrefaction affect the appearance of the hair root. So it ends up looking just like a paintbrush. That's important in an investigation such as the Crafts case, because it indicates that the hair was in tissue and wasn't from a beauty parlor and dumped alongside the road.
The hairs were then compared to hair from the victim's hairbrush recovered from the Crafts house. They matched. The chainsaw was then taken apart. Inside the housing were blue-green cloth fibers and remnants of flesh and blood. The fibers were the same color and fabric as Hella's nightclothes. The flesh in the chainsaw proved to be human, and the blood type matched Hella Crafts. Now it was a matter of finding out who the chainsaw belonged to. The serial number was corroded from being underwater, but Elaine Pagliaro was able to restore it.
Because of the nature of the way metal is formed, the impression goes through several layers. So even if you scrape off the top layer, if you take away that scraped portion, you should be able to raise up the impressed areas below.
She applied a chemical to the surface of the plate, which dissolved the corroded layers of metal, revealing the serial number.
The number is E5921616. All my career, I remember that number.
The serial number was traced back to the dealership. The chainsaw had been purchased by Richard Crafts. The forensics on the chainsaw potentially linked victim and killer, but investigators still had to prove that Hella Crafts was truly dead. After combing the banks of the River Road site for more than a week, Dr. Karazoulis found the final piece of the puzzle.
And as I looked down, I noticed there was an object. And that object turned out to be a human tooth.
In forensics, this is the Holy Grail.
I knew I had everything that I would need to make an identification of a human being.
A comparison with dental records proved the tooth belonged to Hella Crafts. But it suggested more than that. Part of the jawbone was still clinging to the tooth, and part of the root was cut off.
If this tooth were just removed, you wouldn't see this type of a fracture, or you wouldn't see bone attached to it in this way. So I believe that some force broke this tooth from its seat in the jaw and crushed whatever it was holding to pieces.
That force could have been a chainsaw or a wood chipper. Richard Crafts could be connected to both objects, and now indisputably to the victim, his wife, Hella Crafts. The circle was closing in on the airline pilot. The condition of the tooth, coupled with the hair and skin evidence, was enough to allow the medical examiner to declare Hella Crafts dead, 2 months after she disappeared. Based on the trail of evidence, police reconstructed the likely scenario of Hella Craft's death. On the night of November 18th, Hella was preparing for bed when Richard struck her with a blunt object. He got rid of the bloody sheets, but left telltale stains on the mattress and carpet. He had already rented the wood chipper, probably for some legitimate purpose. Then he realized he had the opportunity to kill his wife and use the chipper to dispose of her body. But he knew the opening in the machine wasn't wide enough to fit a human torso. That's where the chainsaw came in.
This isn't something that you would do to an animal. It's just not something that you do. I mean, it's totally beyond the realm of what people do to each other.
Only 6 ounces of material from Hella Craft's remains was ever recovered. Less than 1/1000th of a human body. But it was enough for the police to make their case.
Most people don't realize 2 things. Number one, the lengths to which the police will go to investigate a crime. And number 2, the power of forensics. They don't realize the new developments that have happened within the past few years that have revolutionized forensics in criminal investigation. It's incredible what can be done now when you blend science with investigation.
For his crime, Richard Crafts received a 50-year sentence. His unconventional way of disposing of the body proved to be his undoing, though it took a battery of forensics experts to prove it. But not everyone has access to those resources. One woman's desperate search for her sister would consume 14 years of her life. Ava Dehart was looking for a good time, but she fell in with a bad crowd. Her circle of friends was a motley group of biker wannabes, a touch of menace in the otherwise sleepy riverside town of Fredericksburg, Virginia in 1982. They hung out at a place called the Joker's Wild, a loose-knit gang with too much time on their hands. Ava's boyfriend was the leader of the group. His name was George Patsalis, but he called himself George Sparta. He was a man who was more feared than respected. Ava had dated him for 8 years. During that time, their relationship grew more abusive. Occasionally, she'd leave him, but never for long. On July 20th, 1982, Ava left her house to go to work at the Joker's Wild. That was the last anyone ever saw of her. After a day had gone by with no sign of Ava, her family contacted the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. Detective Billy Bowler explains the investigation.
When the investigation was first initiated, it was a missing persons report, and our sheriff at the time was chief of detectives and picked up the case. He followed through with, interviewed the family. He went to interview Patsalis. Patsalis produces a handwritten letter that was confirmed through family members that it was in her handwriting. More or less a Dear John type letter. I'm leaving, they had a spat, see you later, that kind of thing. I'm not coming back.
If George knew where Ava had gone, he wasn't telling. Neither was anyone else. With no leads and no clear signs of foul play, the sheriff's investigation could go no further.
I think Patsalis, of course, was targeted as a suspect or an individual responsible right from Jump Street, but they had no one coming forward with any information. There was no, we had no body, we had no forensic evidence, we had no Ava Dehart.
And Ava's family had no consolation. Ava's sister Debbie suspected a conspiracy of silence among the gang at the Joker's Wild. She felt the police weren't taking the case seriously. She knew that if Ava was to be found, she'd have to go it alone.
The attitude was a bit hard to deal with in the beginning because I would take them a rumor that I heard or someone that said something, and they would contact me again and tell me they'd followed up on it, and then we'd go through this cycle, this whole roller coaster, emotional roller coaster of going to them and giving them information and then having nothing come of it. And it was very difficult to deal with.
Debbie was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Desperate to find her little sister, she bulldogged every member of the Joker's Wild gang, pumping them for information, taking copious notes. She knew her only hope lay with the surly gang of bikers who said they were Ava's friends. But no one would talk. They were all afraid of George Patsalos. The weeks unfolded into years, but Debbie endured, even though she was forced to realize her sister was probably dead.
My friends say that when I get resolve on an issue, that I don't let go. And I guess I'd wavered in my own heart and mind many times about what I always knew that she was dead, but I wavered in my own mind about what could have happened.
In 1996, a news story caught Debbie's eye. A story about a woman in a footlocker. Her remains were found in Frederick, Maryland in 1982, the same year that Ava disappeared. Identification techniques weren't as sophisticated then.
The body had been misidentified, and the new identification was a young girl, 22 to 26, the right height, the right weight. She was found within 4 weeks of my sister's disappearance and had been missing been in the trunk approximately for 4 to 6 weeks. And so I just really had a very emotional response to that.
The search for her sister would lead her to the largest collection of anatomical remains in the United States. In April 1996, renowned forensic authority Doug Owsley of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington applied his expertise to putting a face on the lady in the trunk.
Well, that was then printed in the papers, and it turned out that Debbie DeHart, the sister of Ava DeHart, happened to see that in the newspapers, and she thought, could that possibly be Ava? Because Ava had disappeared in 1982.
Encouraged by the preliminary description of the lady in the trunk, Debbie acquired Ava's dental records so Owsley could compare them. But sadly, the dental work didn't match. The lady in the trunk was not Ava DeHart. Debbie DeHart's quest showed no sign of ending, but the lady in the trunk provided some unexpected help after all.
There was so much publicity surrounding it. There were TV people and media people pursuing me, and I did some interviews. And as a result of that, I started to get phone calls. People were interested again. And I got some anonymous calls, people with little bits and pieces of information, but information I had needed all along.
After 14 years of pushing, Debbie finally felt like she was making progress. She knew this could be her last chance. She hired private investigator Al Baker to help her follow up with the former members of the Joker's Wild gang.
We began making contact with various people, which Debbie was able to provide us with the names. She had done that thorough job as to know who was part of this group, how we could contact most of them.
Nobody knew anything definite. Many were still afraid of George Patsalos. But one name kept coming up, Barbara Campfield, the woman who became Patsalos' girlfriend after Ava and who eventually married him. One woman in particular said she helped Campfield clean up some blood at the Joker's Wild after Ava's disappearance. At the time, Campfield told her that the blood was the result of a fight. It seemed that Barbara Campfield knew something. But what? Debbie had already tried speaking with her, but got nowhere. Now Baker gave it a try.
I started off by introducing myself to her, providing her my card, giving her phone numbers, and calmly explaining to her that we were now in the investigation with the D. Hart family and that we were not going away, that this investigation would continue, was not going to stop, and we were going to talk to everybody we could to try and find out where Ava was.
Baker kept pursuing Campfield. Realizing that Baker wasn't going to let up, she was persuaded to work out a deal. She began cooperating with Detective Bowler and the Stafford County Sheriff's Department. She directed them to an abandoned home site outside of town. Campfield told Bowler that on the night Ava disappeared, George Petsalis asked Campfield to help him dump something heavy down a well. He told her not to ask any questions. She never dared to.
The well was pointed out to us. We subsequently got a search warrant for the property, went there with the assistance of the state police and the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and called the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue folks to come help us actually in the excavation of the well.
After making sure the conditions were safe, the fire and rescue workers were slowly lowered into the claustrophobic depths of the well. The hole was less than 2 feet square and 19 feet deep. Soon, the workers were hauling up buckets of soil and debris, years of accumulated leaves and dirt that concealed whatever lay below. Then bones started coming out. They were laid on the ground beside the well so an anthropologist could see what they'd found and what was missing. It was clear the bones were human and female.
We found pretty much probably the best part of her whole skeleton in various pieces and forms as we brought those out. Really, they came out in 5-gallon bucket fulls at a time out of the well.
It seemed the mystery of Ava's disappearance had been solved. But were these truly her remains? A comparison of the jaw with Ava's dental records confirmed the terrible yet reassuring truth. Debbie DeHart's sister had been found.
Well, it's certainly better for us to have found her than to have never found her. I don't think we realized how deep the wound was or how it would never heal if we hadn't found her.
For the DeHarts, and in the name of justice, Owsley was entrusted with determining how Ava had died.
My role is to state what the facts are. And to do that, what you have to do is pay very careful attention to the skeleton, to the bones. And if you know how to read the bones, they just are, it's phenomenal what they can tell you. This particular skeleton of Ava DeHart, it tells you exactly what happened to her, and it also provides all of the clues that helped with the determination of her identification.
Owsley studied every inch, scrutinized every fracture to try to determine the cause of death. Was she murdered elsewhere, then dumped in the well? Was she killed by the 19-foot drop? Or was she still alive, trapped, and left to die? The injuries caused by the fall were restricted to the lower half of her body.
Fractures in the foot, the lower leg bones, the thigh bones, and the pelvis are the result of being dropped in the well. When she was dropped in the well, her feet hit the bottom, and that caused breakage of some of the bone. As the force goes up the shin bone, then it causes jamming at the knee joint. And in relation to this, then when you look at the distal end of the femur, these fit together like this, the force compresses into the distal end of the femur, and it causes this compression fracturing right here.
From the condition of her remains, Owsley determined that Ava was probably dead before she was thrown into the well.
This blow to the midface, where it actually broke 4 bones. It broke part of the right maxilla, the left maxilla, and both nasal bones. It just sheared the nasal bones off. And that's telling you that it's coming from her right to left, but it's also going up because there's a slight oblique angle here in the nasal bones. There's no sign of a tool or any being hit with a specific type of weapon. This is something that apparently was done with a fist.
There was not a part of the skeleton that didn't have some type of injury.
It was savage. That's the only way that you can classify it, because I think even the blow to the face would knock most people out. He was simply out to kill the girl.
George Patsalos, now living in Florida, was charged with the murder of Ava Dehart. At the trial, Owsley presented Ava's remains to the jury. Through his forensic interpretation, she was able to testify against her killer.
I think that Doug felt that the dramatic way that she died, that she would speak to the jury, that it would be Ava telling the jury look what happened to me. And I believe the Commonwealth's attorney used those exact words. Look what happened to me.
On October 8, 1997, George Patsalos was sentenced to life in prison for his crimes. The case against Patsalos was solved through forensics, detective work, and second-hand accounts. But suppose a crime had no witnesses, no crime scene, and no trace of a body. In April 1992, a 13-year-old Chevette was towed into an impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. There, it joined the ranks of other abandoned vehicles, awaiting their date with the crusher. At the time, no one knew it, but this car held a terrible secret.
Got it. Go, John.
Everyone in New Albany, Indiana, knew that Eric Humbert and Jonathan Whitesides were the best of friends. They worked together in the U.S. Geological Survey, and they played together after work and on the weekends. So it only seemed fitting that John Whitesides was the last person to see Eric Humbert alive. On the evening of January 15, 1991, after a game of hoops with their co-workers, the two drove to the auto shop to drop Whiteside's truck off for repairs before heading home. But by 9:30 that night, Humbert still hadn't arrived at his house. Eric's wife, Missy, said she phoned Whitesides to see if he'd seen him. Whitesides told her Eric had left just a few minutes ago and assured her he'd be arriving home any minute. But the minutes turned to hours. At 2 a.m., Missy called Whitesides again. Eric still wasn't home, and she was worried. Jonathan said he'd be right over. Eric never returned. Though Missy had spoken to the police the day after Eric disappeared, she didn't file an official missing persons report until 2 weeks later. Their relationship was becoming strained, and she thought Eric may just have wanted a little time by himself. But now she felt something terrible had happened. Eric was gone too long. He wouldn't have left his 18-month-old son. That wasn't like him. Detective Keith Whitlow of the New Albany Police led the investigation.
We began interviewing co-workers. There was rumors that Eric may have had a girlfriend in another state. We checked with that person, and she hadn't seen Eric. So his disappearance was pretty mysterious to everyone. Not only was he gone, but also was his automobile. There was without a trace.
But something of interest did come from interviewing Missy's co-workers. Many said that Jonathan frequently picked her up at work. Some claimed that Jonathan and Missy were having an affair. Suspicions centered around Jonathan Whitesides, but there was not the slightest evidence that anything illegal had happened, nothing to link him to any wrongdoing. The two may have been guilty of indiscretion, but there's no law against that. Months went by, It seemed the earth had swallowed up Eric Humbert and his car. Meanwhile, Whitesides moved in with Missy and her son. Then, in April, 4 months after Eric was reported missing, a white Chevette turned up in a state impoundment lot in Louisville, Kentucky. Unclaimed, it was about to be sold or scrapped.
But they decided, as a matter of routine, to make one last check with the National Crime Information Center to see if this car was in fact stolen and whether they could have located an owner. When they did, they got a hit on the car showing that the car was part of a missing persons investigation right across the Ohio River from them in New Albany, Indiana. We were very, very close to losing a very key piece of the puzzle.
The car belonged to Eric Humbert. It was stripped of its tags. In the hatchback were traces of blood.
Hey, look at that.
Louisville detectives interviewed Whitesides, the last person to see Humbert alive.
Do you know who killed Eric Humbert?
No.
He consented to a polygraph exam.
Do you know where Eric Humbert is?
No.
He failed.
Did you kill Eric Humbert?
No.
When confronted with the results, Whitesides admitted he knew more than he let on. He told police that after the basketball game on the night Eric disappeared, the two men drove to the auto shop to drop off Whitesides' truck. Afterward, they drove to Whitesides' house to work on another car. From there, Whitesides' story took a bizarre twist.
He says that suddenly Eric went into a rage and accused him of having an affair with his wife and produced a knife, and that an altercation, a physical altercation between the two men developed there in the garage. During the scuffle, Jonathan claimed that Eric was accidentally stabbed in the throat, a wound which, according to Jonathan, proved to be fatal.
Jonathan panicked. He thought nobody would believe the freak accident. He loaded the body into the back of the Chevette, drove several miles to a remote spot on the Ohio River, and dumped it in. He couldn't recall exactly where he unloaded it. The police were skeptical of Whitesides' tale. After his statement, he was arrested while they checked out his story.
It just didn't pan out. It just didn't seem logical. We even had officers simulate the combat that he had described, and we found it very difficult to believe that it happened the way that he said that it did.
Unless the body turned up, the only physical evidence to prove or refute Whitesides' story was the blood-stained Chevette. The stains in the hatchback were consistent with a wounded body being stashed there. But one feature stood out. The trunk liner contained an unusual pattern, 5 lines of blood shaped like a chevron. Some blood-soaked object had been pressed against the liner, causing the marks. They were parallel, so they couldn't be impressions of fingers. The stain was notable, but meaningless, at least so far. Under the hood, investigators found a large spatter of blood. In it was a bright green fiber. No one could explain how it got there or what it meant. Inside the engine compartment appeared what looked like human tissue. It was sent off for analysis. Forensics expert Rod Englert was brought in to study the blood evidence. He found the fine mist of blood on the distributor cap wasn't consistent with a knife wound. He demonstrates.
What I'm going to do is take some blood here, and let's say that the end of this eyedropper is the end of a knife. And let's say that it has gone into my neck and I draw it back to maybe stab again, or I just pull it out very quickly. What it will cause is what's called cast off, and cast off is a resultant pattern that you see there. Now if you put these two together, as we have here, there's an enormous amount of difference between those two patterns.
A knife wound creates a cast-off that comes from one direction. But what Englert saw on the distributor cap was multi-directional.
And that only comes about through gunshot.
To Englert, the cloudy mist of blood clearly showed that Whitesides was lying. In Indiana, the pattern of bloodstains in Eric Humbert's Chevette raised doubts that he was stabbed in the throat. More doubts were raised at the forensics lab in Oregon, where the tissue sample collected from the engine was studied by Ray Grimsboe. Microscopic analysis revealed the tissue was human, but it wasn't from anyone's neck.
The arrangement of the cells, how the cells stained, told us that it was brain tissue. It was not from the skin or exfoliated tissue from some other area. This was neural tissue. We had to figure out then, how does it get out of a neck wound? And logically, it couldn't happen that way.
A closer examination of the car revealed a single bullet hole concealed at the base of the windshield wiper. 2 small fragments were recovered and sent to Grimsboe. He confirmed they were fragments of a bullet and its copper jacket. But most intriguing was the single tiny green fiber clinging to the bullet. He didn't know what to make of it. One thing was certain. The car was the scene of a shooting, not a stabbing. Whiteside's story wasn't washing. Seeking the truth, investigators went to the garage at the house where Jonathan Whitesides was living. The garage where he said his friend had accidentally stabbed himself to death. The crime scene was now 4 months old. Would anything be left? At first sight, the garage looked clean. But soon, a 9mm cartridge was found. Days later, a 9mm handgun was retrieved from Whiteside's work van. It seemed Eric Humbert had been shot. The brain tissue and the trajectory of the bullet indicated he was shot in the head. But something was missing. Something didn't seem right.
Well, we don't have a lot of blood spatter. Normally when someone gets shot in the head, we have blood and gore everywhere. In this situation, we had very little. So when we were able to identify that tissue, then as coming from brain, basically, the spatter, the bullet fragment, all tended to fit together. This person probably was shot through the head. And the question became, how'd that happen without getting it everywhere? Well, the small green fiber. I think that's when the little light went on in my head that we have a green fiber on this bullet. Bingo, that's why we don't have the blood. He had a cap on.
The weave pattern of the bloodied watch cap could also have made the chevron-shaped marks in the hatchback. The evidence so far was compelling and consistent, but was it enough to convince a jury the victim was truly Eric Humbert? All attempts to find a body met with failure.
Our body turned out to be a small piece of brain matter and some blood splatters.
The forensics team performed a DNA test on the blood. Problem was, they had nothing to compare it to. To go forward, they'd have to work backward. Blood relatives share similarities in their DNA. The forensics team counted on this to approximate Eric's genetic profile.
To identify Eric Humbert required just a paternity test, basically. We did a family history. We had his mother, his 2 living siblings, and his son and his wife. And so we typed them with DNA, and we took the unknown blood and the tissue from the scene, typed it.
To assure that the evidence wasn't contaminated, the DNA was tested simultaneously at 2 separate labs. The results were consistent, but investigators were still not satisfied. The forensics team needed to get DNA from both of Humbert's parents to be sure their findings were precise and irrefutable. Permission was obtained to exhume his father, who died several years earlier. DNA was extracted from his father's leg bones. The genetic codes from Humbert's father and mother were compared to the DNA from the blood in the Chevette.
We were able to show that, beyond any reasonable doubt, that this would have been consistent with a son of those two people.
Even without Eric Humbert's body, the prosecution had all it needed to convict Jonathan Whitesides. The prosecution alleged that on the last evening of Eric Humbert's life, he went to Jonathan Whitesides' house to help him fix his car. He may have suspected that his best friend was having an affair with his wife, but he couldn't have known how much his best friend wanted him out of the way. While Humbert leaned over his own car to show Whitesides how he'd made a similar repair in his Chevette, Whitesides pulled out a 9mm pistol and shot his friend execution style at point-blank range. He then loaded the body into the back of the car, disposed of it, and abandoned the vehicle. He thought that by eliminating the body, he'd eliminated all the evidence. He was wrong.
Whenever a criminal enters or leaves a crime scene, he always leaves something there. He always takes something with him. And I think that's very, very true. It's just today we are much more capable of finding those things that they take and leave than maybe we were just 10 years ago.
The jury deliberated only 45 minutes before finding Jonathan Whitesides guilty of murder. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. As for Eric Humbert, so far, his body hasn't been found.
Eric's mother told me after Jonathan was sentenced, she grabbed me by the arm and she said, "Please don't quit looking for him." And it's kind of ironic, every time we get information about a body found locally or something, it's like nobody has to say it, everybody goes, you know, like, I wonder if that's Eric. And not as of yet it hadn't been, but you know, we're still in some way, we're still looking.
Not too long ago, when victims went missing, killers went free. Today, the rules are changing. The laws of justice have allied with the laws of science. And even if the victim can't be found, chances are the killer will be. In Reno, Nevada, 2 unidentified women are found dead. Can tiny fibers tie them to their killer? A skeleton, a shopping bag, and a single button are investigators' only clues to the identity of a woman and her killer. A sailor is killed on a Florida beach. Only a tire track in the sand marks the path to justice. The clues to murder often elude the naked eye. But no killer can escape the telltale traces of guilt. Reno, Nevada is known as a betting town. In February of 1995, someone gambled he could kill without a trace. A transient man was searching a dumpster for things he could sell when he made a gruesome discovery. Officers from the Reno police arrived and retrieved the body of an unidentified woman. It was almost completely camouflaged among the debris. For police, the myth of the perfect murder was dispelled long ago. Today, forensic science can win convictions from the most minute clues. But in this case, the killer seemed almost to be playing the odds. He could have disposed of the body in the desert, where no one would ever find it. Instead, he crafted an elaborate parcel, conspicuous because of its size, and hoped the dumpster would be emptied before it was found. The complexity of the shroud was disturbing. The victim had been slipped into several large plastic garbage bags, which had then been carefully sewn inside a sleeping bag. The bundle was then wrapped in yellow plastic and tied with rope. The initial examination of the remains was made by the lead investigator, Detective David Jenkins.
That degree of packaging was unusual because of its complexity, and immediately suggested that there had been a lot of preparation and a lot of time involved in the packaging of the body. And that's uncommon in most body disposals.
Right away, this elaborate wrapping gave police several important clues. The killer needed time to encase the victim like a modern mummy. And he needed a very private laboratory where he could do his grim work. To identify the body, detectives reviewed recent missing person reports. One case stood out. With family photographs and fingerprints, police confirmed that the victim was Catherine Powell. She had disappeared the Friday before the body was discovered.
Her disappearance was first reported that next Monday, 2 days later, when she failed to show up to work. Miss Powell was an elementary school teacher, a very popular teacher. She was loved by her students and the other staff. And so immediately when she was reported as missing, there was a sense of urgency, both by her staff and by her family, who felt that her disappearance was far more sinister than just her not wanting to arrive at work.
At her home, police saw no signs of forced entry or violence.
Basically how you left it.
But when her family looked over the apartment, they noticed several items missing, including a laptop computer and printer, a camera, and her purse. While detectives combed her apartment, forensics investigators pored over the evidence from the dumpster. If the wrappings held a clue to the killer's identity, investigators couldn't find it. They had never seen a case like this before, and the killer's attention to detail made them nervous. Investigators focused on the remains. The ropes and wrappings were preserved for later analysis. Police were not even sure how the victim had died. There was no indication of fatal trauma on the body. Forensic science would have to tell the story. And for an expert eye, there were many trace clues to read. The Washoe County Sheriff's Forensics Lab assigned the case to investigator Rich Berger.
I don't really recall having attended an autopsy where there was such a profusion of trace evidence potential on a person's body. There was apparent a number of blue-green strings and tufts of material located basically from head to toe.
Besides the fibers, Berger found a single metal shaving tangled in the victim's hair. None of these traces matched the fibers or samples gathered at the victim's apartment. Police suspected they were linked to the killer. The victim's body also bore telltale bruises. It appeared that she had been bound, gagged, and possibly tortured. The injuries suggested the killer was male. But new information suggested he hadn't worked alone. While forensic pathologists continued to gather the minute physical evidence, Detective Jenkins studied Powell's credit card records. Any recent charges might shed light on where she had been. He saw that her card was used to buy a $2,000 stereo on February 5th, the same day she disappeared.
Exotic looking. Yeah, she was kind of exotic.
The clerk said he'd chatted with the woman who bought the stereo. She had claimed to be Powell.
They identified themselves as Miss Powell. They were making a purchase to give to their daughter during a wedding. We were aware, having spoken with Miss Powell's family, that Miss Powell had no children.
The clerk told police this woman did not fit the victim's description. He also recalled a crucial detail: the kind of truck the woman drove. Detectives traced it to its owner, a cable television installer named David Middleton.
That break allowed us to focus our investigative efforts specifically on an individual rather than just the overall circumstances involving her disappearance and the use of her credit cards.
Police interviewed David Middleton about Catherine Powell. Though he had recently installed cable service in her home, he said they had talked only briefly.
Do you know a lady by the name of Catherine Powell?
He claimed ignorance about her disappearance and murder. He knew nothing about her credit cards.
What's your profession? What do you do for them?
But a background check revealed that Middleton was a convicted felon and a former police officer. While on duty in Miami, Middleton had lured a young woman into his patrol car, drove her to a secluded place, and sexually assaulted her. Stripped of his badge, Middleton served 3 years in prison. Upon release, he moved to Colorado and then to Nevada. Middleton's girlfriend was charged with fraud for using Catherine Powell's credit card. But because Middleton's truck was used in the crime, police now had grounds to search his home.
We found a firearm, a shotgun. Mr. Middleton in the state of Nevada, because he is a convicted felon, was prohibited by law from possessing that weapon.
Possession of the shotgun was a felony. But while it was cause for Middleton's arrest, it did not implicate him in Powell's murder. Police found no fiber evidence at his home to link him to the crime. Middleton was interrogated again. This time he changed his story. Now he admitted to beginning a sexual relationship with Catherine Powell. He said that he had been with her one night, then left for an hour. When he returned, she was dead. He refused to offer any more information. Middleton was now a prime suspect in Catherine's murder. But investigators had not a scrap of real evidence to link him to the crime. At the Washoe County Forensic Science Lab in Reno, the fibers found clinging to Catherine Powell's body were leading investigators nowhere. Desperate for clues, they re-examined the bruises on the victim's body. Right away, they focused on one in particular. It had an unusual crescent shape. Suspecting it was a bite mark, Detective Jenkins sought the help of forensic odontologist Raymond Rawson.
Well, I saw just a few pictures of a body that had been autopsied, and there was a bruise on the left chest area, just almost to the armpit. It was a bruise that stood out from anything else on the body, so and it had the characteristics of a bite mark.
Hoping this mark would lead them to the suspect, X-rays and plaster impressions were taken of Middleton's teeth and sent to Dr. Rawson. He wondered how hard a person would need to bite in order to leave a bruise like the one found on the victim.
And if you see that, it leaves an indentation. Now, there's no bruising, and we found that you have to actually bite so hard that you can't stand it to create a bruise. So when we see a bruise on the skin, we know that there were at least 200 pounds pressure, and that wasn't a willing situation. Somebody would cry out in pain.
Next, Dr. Rawson compared Middleton's bite pattern with the bruise on the victim's body. He placed the X-ray of the biting edges over a photograph of the bite mark. The details of the X-ray matched the bruise.
We had one tooth that had a wear pattern on it, and that wear pattern was shown in the bruise. So it was a very good match.
The bite mark confirmed that Middleton was with Powell near the time of her death. A bruise this severe was no playful love bite. But neither was it evidence of murder. Police needed more concrete evidence. As news of the case spread, an anonymous informant called the police with a potential clue. Middleton had rented a large storage unit in nearby Sparks, Nevada. A search warrant was immediately served there.
That information was significant because for the first time we were able to locate a specific location where the kinds of activities involving the packaging of the body and the keeping of a body could have occurred.
A storage unit would make a perfect workshop for a killer. Even before detectives entered the shed, they were suspicious of the amount of recent activity there. The entry records, obtained by Deputy District Attorney Tom Beloria, showed how often Middleton visited the unit.
Well, we know from the gate entries, which was computerized at the storage facility, that Dave Middleton made numerous entries into that storage unit the Friday evening that Kathy Powell was abducted from her residence, Saturday, again Sunday, again Monday, again last entry being Tuesday morning.
Were police walking into a glorified closet or a killer's lair? They knew their case against Middleton hinged on what they found here. At first, the shed was unremarkable, crammed with personal property. And anywhere else, the duct tape and coils of rope would have seemed harmless. When they found the stereo receiver that was purchased with the victim's credit card, they knew they were onto something. Then they found the items missing from the victim's home. But police already knew Middleton had been to her apartment. Evidence of burglary does not prove murder. The handcuffs were perhaps a souvenir of Middleton's police days. But the scraps of women's underwear and a stun gun were not so easy to explain away, especially in light of what they found next.
Find another tool.
A refrigerator lay on its back. The freezer's bottom had been cut away, and small, jagged air holes had been drilled into the sides. It had been modified, apparently to hold a human body. Above the refrigerator dangled a system of ropes and pulleys strong enough to hoist a human being. The detectives could only begin to imagine what perversions were acted out here.
This was a torture chamber, simply put. The refrigerator, having been placed on its back, almost suggested a coffin.
But did Middleton's depravity go as far as murder? Investigators still had to link him to the victim. In the refrigerator, they saw small blue-green fibers and human hair. As clues, they provided a glimmer of hope in a room full of horror. The refrigerator was brought back to the crime lab, where Rich Berger analyzed the fibers. To him, the threads in the refrigerator appeared to match those found on Powell's body, and genetic markers from the hair were consistent with the victim's.
The fibers from Powell's body were 100% cotton of a blue-green color, and that similarly those from the refrigerator were composed of 100% cotton and the same color. And that also the metal fragment from Catherine Powell's hair matched the metal and paint that went into the makeup of the freezer compartment of the refrigerator.
The metal shaving found in the victim's hair matched the metal from the crude air holes. Investigators found the link they were looking for. The trace evidence proved that the victim was in David Middleton's storage unit. Detectives now formed a theory of how she died. The air holes were simply inadequate to keep her alive. She had suffocated. While investigators were grappling with the monstrous acts of David Middleton, they learned that Powell may not have been his only victim. On April 9th, a man was walking his dog outside Verde, Nevada. He found the skeletonized remains of a human being. They were entangled in knotted ropes and plastic garbage bags. Police brought the remains to the crime lab. Criminalists compared its DNA to a sample from an unsolved missing persons case. They made a positive match. A check of dental records confirmed the victim's ID. She was Thelma DeVilla, who worked at one of the larger casinos in the area. She had been missing since August 8, 1994, the exact day Middleton had rented the storage shed. The excessive ropes, knots, and garbage bags found on DeVilla's remains mirrored those found on Catherine Powell's body. The knots provided information about the victim's final hours. The stresses applied to the knots showed that both women were alive when their hands and feet were bound, and they had struggled desperately against the ropes before they died.
We specifically looked at knots from two different murders and compared them to each other, showing that the same types of knots had been used in both these deaths.
DeVilla's DNA was then compared to the DNA traces found in Middleton's shed. The results were ironclad. Like Powell, she had been in the shed. But the DNA traces of several other people were also found there. If David Middleton was a serial killer, Powell and DeVilla were the only victims ever found. As the case against Middleton was prepared, the grim sequence of events leading to Powell's death became clear. Middleton, working as a cable TV installer, had probably gained access to her home under the pretext of checking her cable service. He then subdued her and took her to his storage shed. There, she was tied up, brutalized, and kept confined in the airless refrigerator. Sometime during this torture, she died. Middleton methodically wrapped her body in plastic garbage bags, sewed it into a sleeping bag, and enshrouded the bundle with yellow plastic bound with rope. Finally, under cover of night, he disposed of the remains in the dumpster. Police were fortunate the body was ever found. But Middleton didn't realize that a brimming dumpster would appeal not only to him, but also to a transient looking for scraps. He had been clever up to a point. The investigation uncovered the fact that Middleton had installed cable service in an apartment near Thelma DeVia's home the week before she disappeared. And on the day of DeVia's disappearance, a neighbor remembered seeing Middleton near her home. On September 15, 1997, the jury convicted David Middleton of 2 counts of first-degree murder.
Without the DNA evidence, without the trace and fiber evidence, without the metal evidence and experts, and most importantly, the testimony of our pathologist, we would have had no case. Without the trace evidence, we had nothing.
This evidence was so compelling that Middleton was condemned to 2 sentences of death by lethal injection.
Dave Middleton is not your typical killer. All I can say about this guy, as opposed to most of them, is certainly he's police smart and he's street smart. And when you have that, that's a dangerous combination.
Whether murder is committed in an urban jungle or far out in the countryside, some trace of the deed will be left to tell the tale. March 22nd, 1988. Deep in a forest south of St. Louis, there began one of the most baffling cases ever encountered by the Missouri State Highway Patrol.
And try to determine whether it's an Indian grave or it's a fresh grave, or it appears that it's been here for some time.
The case concerned fragments of a human skeleton. Was this an innocent, ancient death, or the victim of some monstrous modern crime? It would take some of the most specialized skills in forensic science to decide.
16 feet.
Sergeants Don Bazzelli, William Conway, and D.W. Kreitz were among the first on the scene.
I received a phone call from the ranger at the Boy Scout camp who advised me that he had discovered some skeletal remains. I went to the scout camp and he directed me to the graveside.
The investigation had its origins 4 months earlier. Raimo Pitkänen, a surveyor from Finland and former Eagle Scout, had been hired to make a map of the SF Boy Scout ranch. On November 2nd, 1987, he made an unwelcome discovery. Frightened of becoming involved, Pitkänen told no one what he found until just before his return to Finland.
Well, Interpol had the Finnish authorities contact the gentleman in Helsinki and conducted an interview with him, which was sent to us in Finnish, after which we had to have translated.
For nearly a week, investigators combed the site. Pickings were thin, a skull and lower jaw, a few strands of dark hair, and an assortment of bones, some scattered several hundred feet from the grave. Many showed tooth marks, signs they had been chewed by animals.
It's a very shallow grave. The bones, doesn't look like we're going to have many bones in it. We're finding on the outer perimeter a couple of bones that may belong to what we've got here. We're going to have to look into it. There's not much to go on right now.
But as the investigation continued, clues slowly began to emerge, including a plastic shopping bag.
We first thought they could have been an Indian burial site, but then when we excavated the grave, finding the service merchandise bag and determining that it was probably from 1979 to 1985, finding that down in the grave really helped us.
There was another clue, one which would eventually narrow down the identity of the victim, a single metal button. Stamped across its face was a logo, Texwood. The next few weeks were frustrating for Conway and his colleagues. Preliminary investigations suggested the remains came from a young woman, perhaps 25 to 30 years of age, the mother of 2 or more children. Surely someone had reported her missing.
Well, the victim was first identified as a Caucasian female, and we started checking missing person reports on Caucasian females, and there were quite a few that fit the approximate age and size and weight of what we had.
In fact, this victim should have been especially easy to identify. She had perfect teeth.
The skull and the remaining teeth indicated no dental work and no cavities, which is very rare in our society, and we were able to eliminate a number of the suspected missing persons that we were investigating.
Soon, the investigators had eliminated all the missing persons from Missouri and from a half-dozen surrounding states. The skeleton in the woods was not a missing person, or rather, no one had reported this young woman as missing. The investigators decided to try another approach. They contacted forensic anthropologist Michael Charney at Colorado State University. He had a remarkable talent for identifying individuals from the most fragmentary skeletons. With near miraculous skill, he could often reconstruct the age, sex, and race, even the facial appearance of a missing person.
I said, wait a minute, the first thing that hit me is that this was not a white person. This was Oriental. This was somebody of Mongoloid extraction, American Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Eskimo, something of that nature.
Charney had picked up on something the police investigators missed. White people and black people have relatively long, narrow faces. People of Mongolian and Asian heritage have much broader faces. Meanwhile, police investigators were making progress of their own with other physical evidence from the grave. Their attention centered on that button with the curious Texwood logo.
We thought when we found the button it would be an easy thing to identify. The word Texwood being on the button, we called Texas, trying to find someone down there that might know it. We found all kind of manufacturers with the name Tex and Texwood in Texas, but nothing would match. Finally, we called U.S. Customs. Within a couple hours, got a call back to contact an agent in New York who put me in touch with the representative of Texwood, who they manufacture the jeans, the blue jeans, in Hong Kong, and they're called the Levi of the Orient.
Texwood sold jeans exclusively in the Far East, slender cuts specifically designed for Asian figures. The police's portrait of the victim was growing clearer. More important, it matched the picture given by Michael Charney, a slim woman, Asian, in her mid or late 20s, a mother of 2 or more children. The likelihood of the victim being from Asia dramatically narrowed the field of possible victims. But who was she? One of the many leads police pursued involved a missing person in Georgia, an Asian female. Officers investigating the case obtained a photo of the woman, which they sent to Charney. Michael Charney's approach was simple in theory, but tricky in practice. Take a photograph of the skull and superimpose it over the image of the possible victim. The fit must be exact if an identification is to be made. Would Charney and his colleague Nita Bittner be able to match the police photographs to the skull found in the woods at the Boy Scout camp?
In this case, when we got the eyes and the nose in close proximity, the nose still doesn't match. It's too broad. The cheek depth is too far apart or not far enough on one side. The teeth are a mismatch, and the chin is still out of place. After trying and refocusing for size and other distortions, we were still unable to come up with a match.
By now, every attempt to identify the victim had failed. Charney had one last suggestion: recreate the woman's face. The reconstruction of a face from a skull is among the most specialized and most spectacular skills in a forensic anthropologist's arsenal. It begins with mathematical precision, a collection of round rubber pegs of varying lengths glued to a plaster cast of the skull.
There's another one that goes right
The
underneath.
pegs are landmarks, each identifying the thickness of soft tissue at particular points on the face. Next, the pegs are connected with strips of modeling clay. Bit by bit, humanity returns. Plastic eyes are placed in the sockets, and the skull comes to life. Careful modeling, perhaps dabbing with a damp sponge, gives the texture of skin. Paint, a black wig, will complete the transformation. For the first time, we can glimpse the victim face to face.
In doing a facial reconstruction, it's not as important that it's absolutely accurate, but that it gives a glimpse of who the person was to somebody out there who will hopefully recognize it. When we do our facial reconstructions, it's generally a last-ditch attempt.
Now, would anyone recognize the face rebuilt by Michael Charney's team? August 24th, a photograph of the reconstructed face appeared in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. 3 days later, 2 informants claimed that the photo looked like their friend, Bunchi Nyhouse. A mother of 2, she was a native of Thailand. They had not seen her since late 1983. Bunchi had a husband, Richard Nyhouse, an ex-GI whom she had met in Bangkok during the Vietnam War.
When we first talked to Mr. Nyhouse, he appeared to be an upstanding citizen. He maintained a nice house by himself, clean, very upstanding citizen in a nice neighborhood. He was gainfully employed, full-time. He was raising 2 sons on his own. They attended church, were very good students.
Nyhouse had a ready explanation for his wife's absence. In December 1983, he and Bunchi had a series of bitter arguments. She had insisted on leaving him and their 2 sons and returning to Bangkok. It was a story the officers didn't entirely believe. The way to resolve the matter was to eliminate Bunchi as the victim in the forest grave.
He was very cooperative. He provided me photos out of their photo album of his wife that we could use if we needed to in the investigation.
The photograph was not ideal, but Michael Charney did his best.
Like any photograph at an angle would be, you have to get it in the same 2 planes exactly, you see.
Despite the difficulties of matching the position of face and skull, in the end, Michael Charney had no doubt that this was Bunchi.
We first received word from our lab that Dr. Charney had matched the photographs of Bunchi Nyhouse to the remains that we had recovered. And at that time, the case took on a whole new outlook. We now knew who our victim was, and we also had a good suspect to start with in Mr. Nyhouse.
The investigators quickly uncovered a series of incriminating facts. Richard Nyhouse and his wife frequently had noisy arguments. He had taken several days off work in December 1983, the same time his wife disappeared. Soon after she vanished, Nyhouse divorced Bunchi and removed her as a beneficiary of his insurance. And then one final damning discovery.
We ultimately discovered that he was a Boy Scout leader, which then tied right into the fact that her remains were found in a Boy Scout camp. He had been actively involved with Boy Scouts with his children for many years.
By now, Richard Nyhouse was the primary suspect. The investigators decided to invite him in for further questioning. They chose their moment with care. A weekend when Nyhouse was camping at the SF Ranch, not far from where his wife's body had been hidden. The officers informed Nyhouse the remains they had recovered had been identified as those of his wife. Nyhouse admitted he had pushed his wife, who had fallen and hurt her head. When she threatened to call the police, to leave him, taking the children with her, he bent down, put his hand over her nose and mouth, and held it there until she was dead. Then he hid her body in the freezer.
The reason that we weren't getting any hits out of the computer files is that the victim's husband never reported her missing. He said that he took her to the airport and she went back to Thailand, but in fact he murdered her. Kept her in his house, in the freezer, for 3 months, and then took her down to the Boy Scout ranch and buried her.
Richard Niehaus was convicted of first-degree murder. He is now serving a life sentence without parole. Time and the elements had taken their toll on Bun Chi's body, adding to the difficulty of finding her killer. But even just a few hours can make the difference between solving a case and losing the trail forever. In September 1983, 2 friends near Jacksonville, Florida were shocked to find the body of a man. He lay on his side at the foot of a sand dune. His head showed severe wounds. Investigators from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office quickly responded. They found no identification on the body. The only clues were a broken pool cue and footprints leading to some tire tracks in the sand. Police worked carefully to gather and protect all the evidence. The tire tracks seemed like the most promising clue to lead to the killer. They were lucky to have it. Rain, the slightest breeze, or one false step could destroy the fragile traces. Preserving the tire tracks required particular expertise. The very act of making a cast could destroy them. Police called the Jacksonville Regional Crime Laboratory and forensic criminalist Ernest Ham.
So the crime scene was processed with these tracks in mind. The footwear tracks and the tire tracks were photographed. Then we want to make a plaster cast, because a plaster cast will give us a true representation, a three-dimensional representation of the object that made it.
Care in the pouring was crucial in order to prevent the weight of the plaster from destroying the print. If the evidence were altered, a killer might go free. After the plaster had set, the cast was carefully cleaned. Now, police had a perfect three-dimensional reproduction of the tire tread. It included the gouges and signs of wear that made that tire unique. But millions of tires roll on America's highways today. It seemed impossible for investigators to find the one tire that had made these tracks. They studied the plaster cast, noting the ribs and grooves of the tread design. Despite the odds of finding the tire, it offered investigators their best chance to catch the killer. Matching the track with a tire on a suspect's car would be as conclusive in court as a fingerprint. Ham searched through thousands of photographs in the pages of the Tread Design Guide to find the one tire he needed. As Ham searched for a clue to the killer, another jogger found a clue to the victim. The wallet belonged to a 21-year-old sailor serving on a ship docked at the Mayport Naval Air Station in Jacksonville. An officer from the ship was called to the morgue. He confirmed that the victim was Jeffrey Michael Russell. An autopsy was performed on the victim's remains. He had been beaten probably with the pool cue found at the scene. It bore no usable fingerprints. He had then been shot once in the head from less than 2 feet away. The pathologist recovered a .357 caliber bullet from the victim's brain. Russell's shipmate said he was well liked and had been out with friends on the night he died.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Police speculated that the victim might have even shared a round of drinks with his killers. He was last seen leaving a party, planning to hitchhike back to base. While the police traced the victim's movements, Ham continued his arduous, time-intensive search of the tread guide. Finally, after reviewing thousands of images, he found the single tire that matched the cast. The track at the beach was made by a tire commonly mounted on pickup trucks. Now, police knew what they were looking for, though it hardly seemed to advance their investigation. To find one truck out of thousands in the Jacksonville area would be daunting. But then police got a lucky break that saved them hundreds of hours. An officer, answering a call about a robbery, pulled over a suspicious truck. The driver tried to run off, but was soon apprehended and arrested. His name was Gregory Kokol. Police inspected his truck. They found a gun under the seat. Kokol was known to police. He was a suspect in a murder case several years before, though never charged. But his name had come up even more recently. Police had just received an anonymous tip that Kokol had bragged of robbing and killing a man on the beach. The gun retrieved from the truck, a .357 revolver, was the same caliber used to kill Russell. The officer then noticed that the tires seemed to resemble the ones involved in Russell's murder. Until now, solving the case had seemed like a long shot. Now, police had the prime suspect and possibly all the evidence to convict him. To make the charges stick, they'd have to link him to the scene of the crime. Police looked to the tires to make that connection. An officer compared Kokol's right front truck tire to a photograph from the tread guide.
The way he described it was that the hair stood up on the back of his neck, that he was really seeing what we told him he was going to see.
The tire was the brand and model they were looking for. But police were not certain it was the same tire that left its mark at the beach. Ham's work wasn't done. He still had to find the exact section of the tire's tread that had made the print. He scrutinized every inch of the tread, looking for cuts, gouges, and wear that matched the portion captured in plaster.
These are the marks and gouges that are put into a tire as you drive it. These will leave what we need for making a positive identification. This makes this tire unique.
But every mile driven since the night of the murder put new wear marks on the tire and altered the old ones. Even if Ham had the exact tire in his lab, it might be too late to make the perfect match. A killer could still go free. Jacksonville police were building a murder case on a foundation of sand. Now they needed harder evidence. After careful analysis, investigators found marks in Gregory Kokol's tire that matched the casting made at the crime scene. But police needed to prove that Kokol himself was there.
They hoped Kokel's .357 would provide the smoking gun they needed. If this was the exact gun that fired the fatal bullet, investigators had to prove that Kokel pulled the trigger. Ham performed 3 tests designed to link the gun with the crime.
Our first examination will be a visual examination, because we want to see if there's any other sort of trace matter on the weapon before we subject it to some sort of processing techniques, such as, in this case, because it's a head wound, if it was a close head wound, we could possibly have tissue blowback into the weapons.
But this test was a dead end. No tissue or blood was found on the gun. The next step was to test it for fingerprints. The gun was sealed in a glass cabinet and exposed to fumes of cyanoacrylate ester, or common superglue. These fumes adhere to fingerprints, making them easier to see and compare.
But based upon the individual characteristics of the ridges, the endings and the divisions and the dots, we can make a positive identification from any part of the body that bears friction skin.
The fumes did their work in just a few minutes. The print on the gun was compared to Kokel's prints at his arrest. They were a perfect match. This one fingerprint only proved that Kokel had held the gun. It did not prove that this gun had fired the fatal bullet. That could only be determined by a ballistics test. The test-fired bullet was placed side by side on a microscope for comparison with the bullet that killed the victim. The investigator lines up the rifling patterns on both bullets. A video monitor allows him to see the minute scratches on the soft lead. If the marks align, he has proof that the same gun fired both bullets. And that's precisely what he saw. The scratch marks on both slugs were identical. Investigators had found the murder weapon. As the prosecution prepared for trial, the events of Russell's final night came into focus. As he hitchhiked back to the base, he was picked up by Gregory Kokel and a friend. But instead of dropping Russell at his quarters, they drove him to the beach, beat him, robbed him of the only dollar he had, and then Kokel shot him. Crimes committed by strangers on strangers are the hardest to solve. But the scratches on the bullet, the fingerprint, and the tire tread bore the traces of the killer's guilt. Close forensic analysis pulled them together to make a solid case against Kokel.
The weapon was the weapon that fired the fatal shot. The fingerprint belonged to the individual that was suspected of committing the crime.
The senseless, random nature of the murder assured that Gregory Kokel and his accomplice would receive stiff sentences. Forensics proved beyond a doubt that Kokel fired the fatal bullet. He was sentenced to death. His friend was deemed an accessory to murder and received 14 years. For years, only the most obvious evidence could be used to solve a murder. Today, scrupulous collection methods by police and rigorous evidence processing by forensics experts are helping to assure that nothing gets overlooked.